Assalamu alaikum everybody, workshop participants, students, those who are interested, welcome. خوش آمدید. IBA میں آپ کو خوش آمدید کہتے ہیں. میں اپنی طرف سے اکبر زیدی میرا نام ہے, اور اس پینل کے حوالے سے اور اس ورکشاپ کے حوالے سے مجھے IBA میں 2 سال ہو گئے ہیں, اور میرا خیال ہے کہ شاید ہی اور بہت سارے ایونٹس ہوئے ہیں, بہت شاندار ایونٹس بھی ہوئے ہیں, لیکن جتنی خوشی آج ہو رہی ہے, یعنی مجھے کہنا نہیں چاہیے کیونکہ دوسرے لوگ برے مان جائیں گے, لیکن آج جتنی مجھے خوشی ہو رہی ہے شاید مجھے اتنی نہیں ہوئی کہ ہم تاریخ کے حوالے سے ایک ایونٹ کرنے جا رہے ہیں. اور نہ صرف اٹس ناٹ اے کانفرنس, اٹس اے ورک شاپ. اور یہ سارا جو اس کا جو مبارکباد دینی چاہیے, جو محنت کی ہے وہ زارا صابری نے کی ہے سنگل ہینڈیڈلی. یعنی انہوں نے ٹیم بنائی ہے, لیکن سارا کچھ یہ زارا کا کیا ہوا ہے. یہ ان کی دلچسپی تھی, میری دلچسپی تھی. ہم نے پہلے یہ کوشش کی تھی کہ پچھلے مہینے ہو جاتی, پھر کووڈ کی دوسری لہر آ گئی, تو اس کے باوجود لاہور سے اور اسلام آباد سے لوگ آئے ہوئے ہیں, اور ہم چاہ رہے تھے کہ ہمارا کی نوٹ ہو, وہ بھی کیتھرین جو ہیں وہ بھی یہاں ہوتی ہیں, لیکن وہ نہیں آ پائیں. سو میرا صرف یہ کام ہے آپ کو ویلکم کرنا, خوش آمدید کہنا, اور امید یہ ہے, مجھے تو بہت دلچسپی ہے ان موضوعات پہ, ان پیپرز کو سننے میں اور سمجھنے میں اور پھر بحث کرنے میں. سو آئی ہوپ وی ول آل enjoy this and learn a great deal, and I hope this is going to become an annual event. I want to put pressure on Zara already for next year, so that she's already thinking اچھا اب اگلے سال کس کو بلاؤں. تو and this should be a continuing event. ہماری جو ایک خاص کوشش تھی جو شاید پوری نہ ہو پائی, ہم میں سے سب لوگ ہسٹری پڑھاتے ہیں یہاں پہ, something called history. پہلے یہی نہیں پتہ کہ ہسٹری کیا ہوتی ہے. ہمیں تو پتہ ہے, لیکن جس طرح اس ملک میں ہسٹری پڑھائی جاتی ہے, جو کہا جاتا ہے کہ پڑھائی جائے, اور جس نوعیت کی ہوتی ہے, اس میں کافی مجھے تو بہت پریشانی ہوتی ہے. اور مجھے پتہ ہے کہ جعفر جو ہیں, ڈاکٹر جعفر احمد IBA میں کئی سالوں سے پڑھا رہے ہیں اور کراچی یونیورسٹی میں بھی پڑھاتے آئے ہیں. ہم اکثر جب ملتے ہیں ہم یہی کہتے ہیں کہ یہ کیا ہے, یہ ہم کیوں پڑھا رہے ہیں, لیکن ہم کوشش یہ کرتے ہیں کہ اس طرح کی تاریخ پڑھائیں, ایون دو اٹس کالڈ دا ہسٹری آف پاکستان or Pakistani history, or even something that you did at A levels and at O levels, at intermediate Pakistan studies. تو ہماری کوشش یہ ہوتی ہے کہ کم از کم to take the discussion further, to question authority, question the set paradigm, and many paradigms exist. So that's what we're trying to do. So ہماری جو بہت مجھے زیادہ دلچسپی جس بات تھی اس ورکشاپ کے اندر رہتے ہوئے, وہ کل کا جو سیشن ہے 11:30 بجے, اٹس ایٹ دا سٹی کیمپس, ٹمورو ول بی دیر, اینڈ دیٹ از ٹاکنگ اباؤٹ how does one teach history. Today we are talking about something more scholarly. There will be papers presented in the morning and in the afternoon, and then we will have a keynote address. Tomorrow we will have a discussion amongst the panelists about what is it that we are teaching. Why are we teaching rubbish? How do we question this? And this is the rubbish that we are giving to you to take home and get A's or A minuses in it. We have to question ourselves first of all, and we'd like students to be present for tomorrow's session as well, at the city campus from 11:30 to 1:30. تو آپ ہمیں بتائیں کہ جو ہم پڑھا رہے ہیں آپ کی سمجھ میں کتنا آ رہا ہے. اور یہاں پہ مختلف یونیورسٹی سے لوگ آئے ہوئے ہیں, LUMS سے آئے ہوئے ہیں, اور بیکن ہاؤس سے آئے ہوئے ہیں, اور قائد اعظم یونیورسٹی سے آئیں گے. تو یہ ہم چاہ رہے ہیں کہ کم از کم ہم جو لوگ پڑھتے ہیں اور پڑھاتے ہیں تاریخ, ڈوئنگ ہسٹری ان پاکستان, دیٹ وی گیٹ فیڈ بیک فرام دوز ہو آر ایکچولی who are suffering that history, who are told that what history is. So I'll welcome you and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So over to you, Zara, and I think the first panel, and welcome all of you and look forward to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, students, faculty members. Akbar Zaidi has given the background of this workshop and the concerns of the historians in this country about how history is taught, and the conference is all about doing history in Pakistan. Tomorrow we'll be discussing about how history has been done away with in Pakistan. So I'm pretty sure that today's and tomorrow's sessions would be quite enlightening and educative for us. I'm Dr. Syed Jaffar Ahmed. My discipline has been political science, But since I did my doctorate in Cambridge, there I think all social sciences are tilted towards history. So I got some grooming in history also, and thereafter, since 1993, I'm teaching politics and history both. In IBA, I'm teaching for the last 11 or 12 years. I have taught Pakistan history and South Asian history. Today's session this conference is very, I would say, innovative in the sense that history has not been approached in our conferences in this manner. And today's session is highly informative and useful, I would say. I haven't attended any such session anywhere. It focuses on the lands and the people in various parts of the world, and particularly in the Indian subcontinent, where Persian has to do something. So it's called Persianate Ecumene, and I think that last night, I may mention, I talked to Zara Sabri and tried to understand what this ecumene is and what Persianate Ecumene is. काफ़ी मैंने इनका दिमाग खाया कल शाम को, और इन्होंने काफ़ी मुझे तफसील से चीज़ें बताईं, और ख़ुशी की बात यह है कि पर्शियनेट एक्यूमेने की जो भी तारीफ़ है वो सुबह तक तो थी, इस वक्त IBA भी इसका हिस्सा बन चुकी है, और मेरा ख़्याल है जहाँ जहाँ ज़हरा साबरी जाती जाएंगी वहाँ ये एक्यूमेने फैलता जाएगा, because she has very good understanding of Persian literature and Persian history, and she has taught about these things, etc. Today's session has three speakers. Dr. Moiz Hasan, Zara Sabri, and then Shayan Rajani. First of all, Dr. Moiz Hasan will present his paper. This is about, Dr. Moiz Hasan is assistant professor in the Department of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts at the IBA-Karachi. He received his MA and PhD in History and Philosophy of Science from the University of Notre Dame, USA, and an Alamiya degree in Islamic and Arabic studies from Pakistan. His research interests lie in the history and philosophy of science in pre-modern Islamic societies, Islamic legal theory, and spirituality. I'm told he's a Sufi also. His current project includes a monograph on the epistemological foundations of mathematical sciences, including astronomy, in pre-modern societies. He has earlier edited 2 volumes on the medieval Central Asian Sufi traditions, which introduced Urdu translations of 8 Arabic and Persian Sufi treatises, published by Fakir Publications in 2014 and 15. So the floor is for you, sir. Each speaker would be given 20 minutes, and after 15 minutes, I'm told that I'll show this card to you if you happen to look here. And then when 1 minute would be left, this would be shown to you, and finally your time will be over. So Dr. Moiz Hasan.
The way this topic of science and medicine and philosophy in pre-modern Islamic world has been discussed in the received narrative. And even though the received narrative is historically awkward, but it continues to inform a lot of our surveys on this topic. So we'll begin with that, and basically 3 issues I want to touch upon about this received narrative. One aspect of this received narrative is what I call the middle link theory, where the value of science and philosophy in Islamic world, in the pre-modern Islamic world, is understood in terms of its value of being an intermediary between Greek science and what follows, which is early modern Latin science. And you have this in the middle. So the story is told that it begins with the Greek science, Plato, Aristotle, and then appropriated by the Islamic scholars in about 7th, 8th, 9th century. There's a translation movement that happens. And the function of Islamic science is either limited to just a storehouse of preserving the Greek ideas, or just adding and making a few alterations but it wasn't enough to give us a scientific revolution. And implicit here is a reductionism, two problems, reductionism and precursorism. Reductionism is to reduce all of originality to Greek ideas. And implicit therein is this assumption that the Arab mind is not capable of originality either because of their race or culture or religion. And hence, even if there is some originality in thought, we need to investigate the origin for that thought. It can be a Greek or Syriac or Pahlavi or any other Indian origin and how it derives from those origin. And then linked with this is the other horn that you have to wrestle with, which is precursorism, another pitfall where the Islamic science or science in Islam, science philosophy in Islam, this is viewed as a forerunner of European ideas. And only those moves in the Islamic culture are valued, which gives us the modern science. And hence, the significance is arising not from within the local context, local culture, but rather an external culture, which is sort of judging the moves by the metric of early modern science, and those moves which actually gave us the scientific revolution. So what ends up happening is there is a lot of praise that comes up with authors and thinkers like they were the father of sociology, or the father of the experimental method. Or, for example, Ibn Khaldun, father of sociology, Jabir ibn Hayyan is the father of chemistry, Ibn al-Haytham is the father of experimental method of science. And in one sense, they're trying to highlight the Islamic contribution, the Muslim contribution, which is fine, but there is a problem here, it's historically awkward, right? Because you're ignoring all the other thinkers, which were not able to give us a scientific revolution. And again, you're judging the value, the significance, the relevance of those ideas by a standard which is not, which is not intrinsic, not internal to that culture. So this can be problematized in several ways, but that's one. Second aspect which normally comes up with this in these surveys is a decline narrative, which I think most of us will be familiar with. There is a traditional periodization that there is a translation movement that happens from Greek to Arabic in about the 8th and 9th century. And then there is a flourishing, a relative flourishing of intellectual activity within Islam that lasts for about 400 years, which is dubbed as the golden age of Islam, or golden age of science and philosophy in Islam. And then beginning roughly from the 12th century, there is a steep decline. And that decline has continued up to our time. There is a contemporary relevance to this decline category. We see that the scientific revolution never occurred in the Islamic milieu. We see the relative flourishing of science and technology in the European context. And we see the abject state of science and research in our Muslim countries, right? So the category which has been used to understand, right, all of these realities is decline. But we can problematize again this category itself. One, that there are several manuscripts which are just lying in universities which need to be examined. And ironically, these manuscripts are in some of the top European universities, Cambridge, Oxford, Paris, and they're unstudied, unedited, unexamined. So just to first, we need to see what exactly is in those manuscripts to be able to come to a decision of what exactly was happening with Muslim science in this period. And secondly, even assuming that there is a decline, how do we understand this? And what we normally see is that instead of understanding this phenomena in terms of an historical explanation, which could be looking at the interplay of different events and conscious urges and deep-seated urges that people have, if you're looking for an historical explanation for this, what we find in this narrative is an essentialist explanation. Essentialist in terms that there was something intrinsically wrong with the way science was being done in the Islamic culture, and it was bad science from day one. Or this happens more in popular works where there is a more insidious way, an insidious explanation that is given, which is more ahistorical and in some cases polemical and ideological, which is that the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, that occasioned a whole-scale decline of science, philosophy in the Islamic world. Or the other explanation, which is Ghazali. Ghazali's Tahafatul Falasifa, his refutation or incoherence of the philosophers, led to this complete dismissal of science, and ever since then, we didn't have any science and philosophy, and we haven't been able to rise back up again, right? And there's also in this narrative a particular view about science and religion, which is assumed. Science is viewed as this cold, calculation-based exercise, which is based upon pure and neat observations and experimentations and experimental methods and thinking of that sort. And it's not grounded in any way in presuppositions or assumptions which are religious in nature or theological in nature or even metaphysical in nature. It's very cold and calculated. That's an assumption about science. And then there's also another assumption which is made about religion, which again derives from this narrative that when they're explaining this decline, that why this decline happened, there is a view of religion which is assumed that religion was antithetical to rationality or science, and it was either this antagonism by the religious institutions or the indifference showed by the religious institutions to science and philosophy, which eventually was responsible for the decline. And again, implicit here is this assumption of viewing religion as a homogeneous entity, which is unchanging and sort of just anti-science and anti-rationality. And this again is historically awkward and sort of can be problematized in several ways. And it has been problematized in several ways by different scholars in different areas and different disciplines. And as a result of that, this narrative has paled in vigor in recent years. It's sort of considered ahistorical in several ways. What I want to sort of now focus on is how I will try to problematize this in a very particular, in a very specific way, by focusing on one person, Rajani, who was a 14th century thinker. And again, from within Rajani, there's so much evidence that can counter this narrative. I will just pick one thing, one specific issue that he speaks about, which is this issue about philosophy of science, and in particular philosophy of mathematical sciences. And just to give a brief context who Rajani is, here we're speaking about someone who's living in the 14th, 15th century, which according to the classical narrative is this era, this period of decline and stagnation. And what we find instead is that far from the stagnation of thought and ideas, here we have an individual which comes up with this hugely important and influential contribution to the philosophy of mathematical objects, which basically it's a question about how mathematics can apply to the real world. Right, so you have mathematics, and this is your mental construction, and then how that applies to the physical world outside, right? And he comes up with a very novel contribution to this issue. And interestingly and ironically, this whole debate, this whole discussion of how mathematics relates to physical objects, that is being done in a work which is a work of kalam. Kalam is the closest Islamic equivalent of theology. And kalam was this Islamic discipline which the primary purpose of this discipline was to reflect in a rational way about the truths given by revelation. And in the process of that rational reflection, they would discuss things like epistemology, cosmology, structure of the world, structure of the entities which describe the world, etc. And this is a fascinating feature that we find in the history of Islamic science and philosophy, that a lot of science and philosophy is happening in not just scientific treatises, but also in these works of kalam, which are ostensibly and apparently religious works, but that this tells us something, right? This tells us something about this conflict model that we have between science and religion, which might apply in different other traditions, but here, especially in the case of Rajani and many other kalam practitioners, it's very hard to accept that. Because what you find instead is that scientific discussions, philosophical discussions are infused within the religious scholarship, infused within. They're sort of part of the religious scholarship, and it's very difficult to divorce and say this is religion and this is science. It's sort of, there is a fusion, there is a synthesis, there is a cross-fertilization that we find of these different disciplines happening in their thought. And part of the ingenuity of these thinkers is that how they can combine different approaches to knowledge, right, into a coherent scheme, right? So you have the theology, you have the philosophy, you even have the Sufi, the metaphysics, right, a higher epistemology, and putting all of that together into this overarching scheme and looking at that and using that to understand some of these issues. So coming to this particular issue which I want to speak about, that how does mathematics relate with the physical objects that are outside in the external world? And what exactly are these mathematical entities? What is their ontological status, right? So here we find that this is a fascinating debate that happens in about the 14th, 15th century, where Rajani, he's responding to one thinker known as E.G. By the way, Rajani and E.G. both are mutakallim, both are kalam practitioners, but they are grappling with this question of philosophy of mathematical objects, the philosophy of mathematics here. So in one such memorable exchange, we have this person E.G., whom Rajani will respond later. He is speaking about these geometrical objects. And then he comes up with this statement, after listing all of these geometrical objects, he says that all these are conjectural entities, mental entities. And one does not know their existence externally, meaning that you don't know their existence through your external sensual perception, right? So they're just mental constructs in your mind. And based upon them are their signs, the signs of the philosophers, the signs of the astronomers, right? Based upon them are their signs in which they claim certainty. And so here we have him expressing that these geometrical entities, number one, are mental constructs. They don't have any correspondence with the external world. And then what you find is another statement here. Okay. That what about the knowledge that you can get from these geometrical objects? How confident should a person be? So E.G. displays a skeptical stance that all these are conjectural things that have no existence in the external world, and religious prohibition does not extend to them. They're not related with the belief, nor are they subject to affirmation or negation. Instead, we have only cited them so that you may grasp their intentions, and when you see them as mere imaginings, which are more tedious than a spider's web, you will cease to be frightened by the clanking noise of these words. So the portrayal that we have here is that these geometrical objects, or these models which are based upon such objects, they are not, properly speaking, descriptions of reality, descriptions of the world. They can neither be affirmed nor rejected, and this can be understood what later came to be known as an instrumentalist view of science, where you're not tracking reality, but you're just providing a description. It's just a way to regulate phenomena. It's just like a computational device that will help you predict the positions of the planets and the motions of the celestial orbs and etc. So it's nothing to do with the reality, right? Because reality has to do with the external world, and these are just mental objects. These are just mental constructs, right? So we're not speaking here about reality, right? And secondly, since because they don't have any correspondence with the reality, hence this whole notion of truth does not apply to them. Because in the pre-modern concept, truth was understood as corresponds with the reality. And when they don't have an existence in external reality, then the whole idea of truth doesn't apply. Right? So truth or falsehood, sidq or kizb doesn't apply to these things. And he, in fact, the spider's web, this is an ishara to an ayat of the Quran where in a logical way, that ayat was supposed to mean that they're not related to demonstrative proof. They cannot be demonstrated. Right? They don't fulfill the criteria of demonstration. So they're not that type of scientific knowledge. So you can see here that E.G. is sort of skeptical and not confident about the knowledge that a person can gain through these mathematical geometrical objects. Rajani will respond. And he does so by beginning with a very gracious that one may say that mathematical objects are yes, mental, right? So he says these and their like, despite not having any existence in the external reality, they are nonetheless conjectural. So he is admitting that they don't have an existence in the external reality, and they're mental constructs, they're imaginary things. However, the key thing here is, he says that they're imagined correctly in accordance to what is in nafsul amr. this is a particularly key phrase that he mentions. Nafsul Amr means that something in itself, that these things are imagined correctly in of themselves. And in another Risala, which is exactly a Risala fi Tahqiq Nafsul Amr, he explains what he means by Nafsul Amr. And there he explains and he says that yes, these objects, mathematical entities, they don't have existence in the external world. So they don't have external reality. They're mental, but at the same time, they are there in the objective realm. There is an objective reality, right? So sort of think about this as follows, that there is something that you experience which is given to you by your physical senses. That's the external reality, right? And there is something which is not there in the external reality, which you don't get through your senses, but you just think about using your mental faculty. That's the mental reality. Rajani is sort of splicing this up and saying that you have the external reality, you have the mental reality, but then there is something which exists independent of your experience, independent of the human subject. Prior to the human subject, there is an objective reality. And this is sort of a striking resemblance here with Kant's division of phenomena and noumena, that you can see that there is something which is objectively there, right? Before the human subject comes and starts to interact with it and says whether they exist outwardly or they exist in the mind. Before that, right, there is an objective factual reality where these mathematical entities have an establishment. So they're established, right? They're realized in this objective reality. And hence, he gives them a relationship, a correspondence with a reality, right? Obviously, it's not the external reality, it's an objective reality, but they do conform, right? And this is particularly important because now he can claim that these mental entities are not fictions of the imagination, right? They are not like ruby mountains or two-headed monsters, right? Two-headed men. These are not just fictional imaginations or fictions of the mind. Rather, they do have a correspondence in reality, which is the objective reality, right? And secondly, since they do have a correspondence, so we can now speak about truth. Because again, go back to truth. Truth, he says, is not only correspondence with external reality, it is also correspondence with things in the factual reality, the nafsul amr. And if these mental constructs in your mind, if they can correspond to something which is in the factual, the objective reality, then they can have a claim on truth. And then he goes on to say that not only these mathematical objects actually do correspond. These models in astronomy, they do correspond to what is there in the nafsul amr, and hence we can speak about them as giving knowledge which is true, and hence we can be certain, we can be confident, right, about the knowledge that we're getting from
Dr.
Moiz,
this is last minute now.
Right, so I'll just summarize now that what I've said is that number one, we need to contextualize the ideas of these thinkers in their own culture, right? And only when we do that, then we can derive the significance, what it means for them, right? As opposed to deriving and imposing a foreign framework on them, we need to derive significance for these debates for the actors themselves, right? That what types of questions they were asking and why these questions were relevant for them. And secondly, I've said that in the case of Rajani, we find a very novel contribution that he is making here in the form of this objective reality, which is a lesson, right? Which is a lesson in this history of the philosophy of mathematics, which again makes us rethink of a traditional periodization of decline, right? The so-called stagnation period where something like this, these debates are happening, right? So we need to rethink about how we periodize our history, a history of science in Islam. And lastly, that this is happening, all of this debate, fascinating debate, right? This is happening in a work of kalam, in a work which is ostensibly, apparently a work of religion, right? And this cross-fertilization of thoughts and disciplines, it makes us rethink how we want to understand the relationship between religious scholarship and scientific scholarship. I think I've said enough to provoke you. I hope I provoked you. So I'm going to stop here. And again, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moiz Hasan. Of course, it's very fascinating and provoking. I'm pretty sure that during the question-answer session, certainly some questions would come up to further understand what your thesis is. Long time back in my student life, I once tried to understand Whitehead's and Bertrand Russell's Principia Mathematica. That was a whole exercise of secularization of mathematics. Today, I saw a totally different paradigm of how theology and mathematical sciences can cross-fertilize to enrich each other. So to the participants, I would say, please keep your questions in mind or write them down. So after all the three presentations are made, there will be a session of question answer. I will put the first question to you, Dr. Saab. You talked about Rajani, which I understand was an Arab mathematician. अभी ना जवाब दें, बाद में दे दीजिएगा, मैं सवाल भूल जाऊंगा इसलिए आपको बता रहा हूँ कि how come he fit in this Persianate Ecumene, इस पूरे फ्रेमवर्क में आप उन्हें कहाँ कैसे रख रहे हैं. Anyway, इसका उस बाद में जवाब दीजिएगा. Now the second presentation is by Zara Sabri, lecturer in Indo-Islamic history and Urdu literature at the Department of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts at IBA. She received her MA degree from the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University in the city of New York. She has taught history and Urdu literature at McGill University, Canada, the Aga Khan University, Pakistan, and the University of Karachi's Pakistan Studies Center. Her research focuses on Mughal history and the influence of the Persianate on Indo-Muslim languages, cultures, and traditions of learning, as well as politics of identity centered around Urdu in South Asia. इतना कुछ इन्होंने लिखा भी है और इनकी एजुकेशन इतनी डाइवर्स है कि इनकी सीवी पढ़ना और समझना भी एक एक्सरसाइज है. और वेल अब आप देखें कि कितना इल्म के दरिया ये बहाती हैं यहाँ पे. ज़हरा.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jaffar. Thank you so much. और आपको इसलिए पता है क्योंकि आपको मेरे CV देखने का मौका मिला, क्योंकि where I was teaching at the Pakistan Studies Center, you were the director, and it was one of the most fulfilling teaching experiences of my life working at the center. So thank you very much. और मैं just before I start my presentation, I would like to say one thing that it's so nice. Thank you so much, Moiz, for that presentation. The whole point of bringing this together, this program, was for one thing to debate about the directions in which Pakistani history in the discipline of history in Pakistan has been going and should go, but also to see what kinds of history is being done by historians in Pakistan. So thanks, Moiz, for giving us an example of one kind of history that's being done here, which is very, very interesting and important. And just to add to what Dr. Jaffar, the question that he posed to you, I would be interested to know the same thing, because of course, Rajani, he is a scholar working in Arabic, but living in Iran. So how does that milieu, does it have any kind of impact? Would we describe him as an Iranian scholar working on in Arabic on these disciplines? So we can deal with that later when that comes. Thank you. Okay, so I'll start now my presentation. So my presentation today concerns a foreword that the famous Indian poet of Persian, Amir Khusro, wrote for his third divan of poetry, Ghuratul Kamal, which means prime of perfection. Written in 1294, this dibacha or foreword is considered to be an extremely important text with regard to Indo-Iranian poetics and Persian poetry in India. So this is the text that we are looking at. In this text, Amir Khusro argues vigorously to defend the high standards of Persian poetry in general and of the Persian language as used in India in particular, insisting that the Persian poets of India and within India, Delhi most especially, should not be underestimated, and in fact their mastery over this language outrivaled that of many other Iranian and Central Asian regions where Persian was current in his era. In this dibacha, Khusro tackles several themes in a seemingly meandering fashion. In the lead-up to the part that concerns us, he first defends the art of poetry against religious criticism. Then he presents three reasons which make Persian poetry superior to Arabic poetry, that the metric rules of Arabic poetry aren't as stringent as Persian poetry, that Arabic as a language allows much more flexibility than Persian, since many words in Arabic mean the same thing, unlike words in Persian. And thirdly, and most importantly, that there is only the qafiya and not the radif in Arabic poetic conventions. So that, of course, it makes things much more flexible. Then he presents an additional reason which pertains to Persian speakers rather than Persian poetry. Persian speakers who don't speak Arabic natively can compose very well in Arabic, but native Arabic speakers cannot do the same in Persian, and even if they master the writing, they cannot master the pronunciation of letters like g, gaf. So these letters become j in Arabic. From talking of people's weaknesses with respect to languages not native to them, he comes to India, and in India, most especially to Delhi, where he argues people are able to achieve impressive mastery of non-native languages like Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, and win tremendous admiration from just-minded people from lands where these languages are natively spoken. These native speakers are stunned at the linguistic dexterity of poets in India when they arrive here, and openly appreciative of it. The opposite is not true, Khusro emphasizes. People who arrive in cities like Delhi from other lands have a very hard time mastering local languages like Hindavi, which is an old name for Urdu, especially in terms of pronunciation. We can, because we have, letters like r and d, so, people from Turkey, etc., they don't they have a hard time with this. We can presume what he calls Hindavi to be a kind of earlier form of modern Urdu and Hindi. This sort of thing is not just said in Dibacha Ghuratul Kamal. Khusro makes a similar observation about Hindustani dexterity at mastering foreign tongues versus visitors' lack of ability in doing so in his Masnavi No Sipair, among several other virtues of India that he famously outlines there. Unfortunately, Khusro's rather jocular, hyperbolic tone in this Masnavi has been ignored in recent decades, and his laudatory, poetic description of India have been clutched at rather desperately and extolled over-enthusiastically as evidence of Muslim Khusro's patriotism and belief in India's superiority over other lands and cultures. And this has been done by very senior Muslim historians and academics who would be quite aware, one would think, that if Khusro has praised local Indian customs and achievements in one place in his writing, he has spoken quite disparagingly about them in others, including in this Dipacha that we are discussing. These are the typical sorts of insults towards the natives of India that we see in Persianate or Islamic literature. Crow-faced, kavve jaisi shakal hai, black infidels, ye kale kafir hain. The blackness of infidelity was overcome by the light of Islam. Cow dung worshipping. These people are cow dung worshipping. The typical things that we've always heard and continue to hear till today. So that's why it's all the more astounding that despite all this endless evidence, many Indian scholars still see fit to present a one-dimensional portrait of Khusro. As one scholar writes, it seems by the 13th century the concept of India as a distinct geographical entity came into Indo-Persian literature along with an understanding of its composite culture, India's composite culture, and also with it a sense of love of the country. The most prominent examples of such patriotism and ideas of a common heritage appear in the writings of Amir Khusro, the poet laureate of the Delhi Sultanate. Now this term composite culture, ye kya hai? It's an oft-invoked and highly problematic notion signifying an idealized view of all religious communities of India or a certain region of India as having developed a vast degree of similarity in lifestyle, speech patterns, and rituals before the dawn of colonial modernity and its disruptive, divisive tendencies. Unfortunately and unsurprisingly, to talk of India or South Asia ever having a composite culture of this sort is not the kind of statement that stands up to deeper historical examination. Another writer who has compiled all of Khusro's statements regarding this poet's supposed love and fervor for India in an Urdu book entitled Hindustan Amir Khusro ki nazar mein describes Khusro thus. Amir Khusro मुहिब्बान वतन के शहजादे कहलाए जाने के मुस्तहक हैं और उनकी ज़िंदगी तमाम मुहिब्बान वतन के लिए एक पैगाम है कि अपने हम वतनों के दिलों की तस्खीर के लिए मजहबी अकायद, रूहानी वारदात और ज़ाती ख़यालात की खामखा वहदत ज़रूरी नहीं, बल्कि सच्चे जज्बात के साथ रवादारी, दिलदारी, कुशादा दिली, वसीउल मशरबी, बाहमी मुफाहमत, मुसालहत, मुवाफ़क़त और यगानगत की ज़रूरत होती है. So, I translate, Amir Khusro deserves to be called the Prince of Patriots, and his life is a message for all patriots and indicates that the pointless unity of religious beliefs, spiritual contingencies, and personal thoughts is not necessary for captivating the hearts of one's fellow countrymen. Rather, there is a need for a sincerely felt spirit of liberality, kindness, magnanimity, religious tolerance, humaneness, mutual compromise, peaceability, congeniality, and concord. So as you see, very modern political desires and aspirational values are being projected back onto a pre-modern medieval Indian Muslim poet. Now, no doubt, various remarks of Khusro's India's relative strengths are, as compared to other lands, are well known and famous. But I would like to analyze them a little differently than they often are. In my own view, the kind of stray remarks Khusro makes in praise of India can often be taken too seriously. Such remarks have now had a long history of being used in disturbing apologetic moves to ensure a minority Muslim population greater physical security and acceptance in post-partition India. And too many Indian Muslim and non-Muslim intellectuals have unfortunately been seen jumping on this understandable but still disastrous bandwagon of feeding the ego of the nationalist beast, which craves praise and admiration for the land and country far before the birth of that country. Khusro's remarks are perhaps more aptly interpreted not as displaying a rather anachronistic sense of patriotism, but as signifying that if Hindustan is to be praised as a poetic theme, then such features are to be praised, and this is the style it should be praised in, that is Khusro's own style. It is interesting to think about why Khusro, much more than any other Indian poet or Persian, tends to be brought into service today as a mascot for Hindu-Muslim communal harmony based upon the notion of a composite culture. One reason for this could be the musical contributions associated with Khusro's name, as well as his widely held reputation of writing of popular verse in a language which comes close to India's present-day lingua franca of Urdu, Hindustani, Hindi, whatever you may choose to call it. I say reputation because we don't have definitive proof that this popular old Urdu verse has been written by Khusro, even though it is clear from the dibacha under discussion that he did write some form of old Urdu verse casually to circulate among friends, though no manuscript from his time survives. The other reason, as already referred to earlier, for Khusro becoming a kind of modern Indian nationalist symbol is that he is famous for certain mention he has made of India, whether in identifying himself with the land. In a few places he refers to himself as a parrot of India, Tutiye Hind, or describing the land's attributes and features in his poetry. In the modern period, when nationalism has become hegemonic as a way of conceiving one's geographical surroundings, such references in Khusro's poetries appear to have taken on an added prominence and utility against the background of a poetic landscape where there are few and far between. As a scholar, Aziz Ahmed writes, remarkable in the Persian poetry, and the quote is there, and remarkable in the Persian poetry written in India, except for a few specimens in Amir Khusro, is the complete rejection of Indian life and landscape as valid poetical material. In exile in India, Persian poetry continues to occupy itself with transoxonian, that is Mawra un Nehr, and Persian flowers, the tulip and the rose, rather than the Indian champak or lotus. It ignores Indian birds and beasts, the aroma of Indian bazaars and the fragrance of Indian spices, and concentrates entirely on borrowings from a life and a scene of which most Muslim poets in India had no first-hand knowledge. They relied exclusively for their metaphors, compound epithets, and poetic formulae on the recognized inter-Islamic imagery based on the example and authority of great Persian and Central Asian poets outside India. This foreign imagery, woven into complex and multiple patterns, became the accepted stock in trade of Indo-Persian and later Urdu conventional poetic diction. Unlike Sanskrit and Hindi, in Persian and Urdu, the beloved is of indeterminate sex and could be either man or woman. This situation raised no grammatical problem in Persian because Persian, doesn't reflect gender. Urdu chose to deal with it by using the masculine gender throughout. Even when you're talking about a woman, you would say tum dur the to kya hua. You wouldn't say tum dur thi to kya hua, right? Right, tum mil gaye to kya hua. Okay, so though the poetic diction completely ignored the Indian milieu, Indian loan words occasionally found their way into Persian poetry as early as the 11th century in the diction of Firdausi, Farruhi and Minucheri, court poets of Mahmud of Ghazna. Amir Khusro deliberately borrowed Indian words when the context demanded local color or description, but not in his ghazals, in which he also strictly adhered to the conventional poetic diction. After Khusro, there was a long interval before anyone discovered the Indian scene around him, until Jahangir, in his sensuous response to beauty in all forms, described in his prose autobiography the varieties of the Indian water lily, or the love of the bee for the lotus in the Hindu lore, or the Noel cuckoo as the nightingale of India. So, where the Ghuratul Kamal is concerned, it is also important to note that Khusro's praise and defense of India is concentrated on a very, very particular milieu that he himself springs from and belongs to. One thing that Khusro is proud of is the linguistic dexterity of people in many mostly Muslim-ruled places in Hindustan, and in particular of the people lucky enough to be residents of Delhi. The other thing he is proud of is that a very standardized, high quality of Persian prevails in India, and this applies to the length and breadth of the region he is discussing without any regional variations. So different regions of India, they don't speak their own kind of Persian, they speak the same kind of standard Persian, so he's very proud of that. He also confirms something that I was particularly interested to note, since this was something that I long felt instinctively as a graduate student grappling with Persian from various regions, that our Persian in India, meaning our Persian in South Asia, bears greater resemblance to the Persian of Transoxiana than that of any other region. So it's our Persian is kind of more similar to the kind of Persian that we hear used in Central Asia. He writes, then, perhaps in Iran, he writes, and you can see the original Persian on screen. And I'll read out my translation of it. Yeah, and as for the Persian tongue, which has arrived here through the tongue of the native Persians, except for the expression of Transoxiana, which accords with the Persian of Hindustan, the expression of no other place possessive enunciative correctness. Thus the Khurasani pronounces che as chi, and some of them pronounce kuja as kuju, and write che rather than chi, and kuja rather than kuju rather than kuja. And the kuja rather than kuju. And the correct form of a word is that in which it is written. Where they are concerned, there are many words of this sort whose spoken form erroneously differs from the written form. कि लिखा कुछ है और हम कह कुछ रहे हैं. जैसे हम लिखते नहीं हैं लेकिन हम कहते नहीं हैं, right? To sum up, I have shortened this account, Khusro says, to avoid making it protracted. And then Khusro continues and says, however, in Hindustan, Persian speech is uniform from the banks of the river Indus to the circumambient ocean. It is a great tongue such as this that is at our disposal. If I speak without constraint, it is because I have the capacity for it. He whose tongue is thus loquacious, it befits him to speak without constraint. God, the opener of doors, has opened the door of speech to us, and this Persian of ours is Dari Persian. The conventions of the Hindi language, meaning the Urdu language, change every 100 koros. So every few miles, the conventions of change, the dialect changes. But Persian is uniform over these 4,000 or so farhangs, and it is a kind of Persian where the utterance of the tongue equates to and accords completely with the written word, and is neither like that of the Utraris and the Bala Sagunians. So Utrar and Bala Sagun are medieval towns located at sites in modern day Kazakhstan. So at an earlier point in time, Utrar was actually called Farab. So Khusro says these people, Utraris and Balasunis, he's making fun of them. They pronounce Karda as Kardakun and Kardahun, not like that of, and it's not like that of Suistanis for whom it is necessary to say heen at the end of a word. For example, Guftahin and Raftahin. So all those northerners who arrive here in Hindustan from among the learned and accomplished and eloquent, not the common rascals. So he's talking about the educated people. So they praised the Persian of Delhi. And when the people of Delhi, as a joke, repeated their words stutteringly and also spoke in a manner that mirrored their speech, bringing any kind of rebutting evidence against our tongue did not become possible for them. And they could not allege an error or bring a reproof. For our expression is extremely soft, harmonious, refined, chaste, correct, and lucid. E Khurasani, Togar, Guftar man, Nashnidai, Bash, Tabato Rasad, in Nuktai, Gharrae man. O Khurasani, if you have not heard my speech, wait till you arrive at this splendid point of mine. So when he says Khurasani, he's talking to Iranians. Latifa inast ke mara dar zabane hama sukhan hast, wa hech kasra dar zabane ma sukhan nist. Khusro also has a number of criticisms of the Sistanis and the Persian of people from various other regions. He compares their Persian speech and expression unfavorably with Indian Persian. It is valuable to us as modern readers to have a sense of how a 13th century Indian poet such as Khusro's sense of Persian in India versus Persian in other regions functioned, and how little was his sense of deference to Persian as spoken in its Iranian homeland. It may also be an interesting exercise to see how this compares with the attitude towards Iran of later Indian poets of Persian such as Ghalib. It has been famously said that the first great classical Persian poet of India was a Lachin Turk, and the last great classical Persian poet of India was an Aibak Turk. So these were Turks who were famous Persian poets. Hence, they were both ethnically Turks. The first is Amir Khusro in the 13th century, and the last is Mirza Ghalib, 6 centuries later, who was the last great classical Persian poet. Thus, it is interesting to compare their professed attitude towards the language's place of origin. Ghalib has famously been described as boasting of knowing Persian grammar and syntax like a Persian and not like an Indian. And this feeling apparently led him to the imitation of good Persian models rather than the continuation of the un-Persian but new style of poets like Bedil. So he says that, people from Delhi and Lucknow, even the learned ones, should not be considered authoritative because they're not Ahle Zaban, they're not from Isfahan. And in Ghalib's view, Persian is really the tongue of Iranians, and it's difficult for us Indians but natural for them. So a lot of time has passed, but it may also be a personal attitude which other people in Ghalib's time may not agree with. So Ghalib says he's not going to follow the examples of Indians but of Iranians. So, and he wants to reconstruct the real Iranian Persian, if not that of Firdausi or Saadi, but at least of Zuhuri and Naziri. So having discussed these remarks of Khusro, I would just very, very shortly like to come to the last part of my presentation, which actually concerns Delhi's mastery, not over Persian, but of Urdu in the modern era. So what I found really interesting, this is just anecdotal, it's not text-based. I'll show you a slide, is that, the place where Urdu originates is really, this is the place. This UP, where Urdu really originates near Delhi. It originates from there, the modern standard Urdu that we speak today. But it was also very widespread in Bihar, where on the local ground there was dialect, but otherwise educated people were using Urdu and they called themselves native speakers to some extent. And Hyderabad also was a center of Urdu, and also like this place where Bhopal, right? And these are Pakistani cities today. Karachi, of course, got a lot of migrants from here, but very interestingly find that attitude that among Pakistanis there's a similar attitude to Khusro, that in India is a place of different kinds of Urdu spoken, non-standard, and they find increasingly the modern Pakistani finds this very strange, and his imagination is very much shaped by the broadcast media, Radio Pakistan, etc., which really promoted a highly standard Delhi variety of Urdu. I would say Delhi because, in Lucknow there were variants like, they would say Andhiara instead of Andhera, and Ujjala instead of Ujala, but we see all that has died out, and a very high standard thing has survived in Pakistan, and increasingly they are not looking towards India in this generation particularly to look at examples from there, and they find that they themselves are, are like the flag bearers of the original Urdu of Lucknow and Delhi. The strange situation is also that in India, of course, there's not much necessarily to compete with because of the particular situation of Urdu there. So again, these people emerge as extremely confident in this field. And secondly, something which is comparable is that Urdu is native to only 8% of people here in Pakistan, and many Urdu, really good Urdu speakers all over Pakistan don't really come across or interact with native speakers. They see them on television, etc., but they don't really interact, they don't necessarily learn from this. So they learn Urdu from books, and it's highly standard. And you know, even if they speak something non-standard casually, they write highly standard Urdu. So many of these attitudes, that this kind of pride of you know, the Delhi standard of Persian and Delhi standard of Urdu is very much reflected there. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's it.
Excellent, very thought-provoking paper, I would say. Now we'll come to the third presentation by Dr. Shayan Rajani, who is Assistant Professor of History at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. He received his PhD in History from Tufts University. He works on early modern Sindh and the Mughal world. His research interests include the study of the individual, region, and gender and sexuality. And the paper he's presenting today is The Men in the Inscription, Rethinking the Individual in the Mughal World.
Is this working? Yeah. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Dr. Akbar Zaidi. Thank you, Zara, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to join all of you. In the 20 minutes that I have, I will walk you guys through, or walk with you through one monument, that monument up over there, which was started by Babur, continued by a bunch of other people. And in making some limited observations about it, I want to think about early modern individuality and authorship with you all today. So here goes. On 5th September 1522, Babur took the fortress of Kandahar. It had been 15 years since his first attempt to oust the Arguns, who had wielded power as deputies of the Timurids, Uzbeks, and Safavids in unfaltering succession. But now, with Kandahar and Kabul in his control, Babur held two most important cities on the trade routes between India and Central Asia. Babur marked his conquest of Kandahar by inaugurating a monument, an arched grotto carved into the side of a mountain near the city. It became known locally as the Chehel Zina, or the 40 Steps, the name approximating the 42 steps which led from the base of the mountain to the hall. You can see the steps up there on that picture. At the top of the stairs, perhaps 2/3 of the way up the mountain, is a broad platform from which the imposing chamber can be viewed. There you go. Walled on 3 sides, the vaulted chamber, or Ivan, is entirely open on the 4th. The lines of the chamber walls rise up straight, curving towards a top into a pointed arch. The exterior wall of the mountain, contiguous with the opening, is smooth and flat, enabling the precise geometry of the structure to deliver its full impact. The chamber is 1 step up from the platform, emphasizing the discontinuity between the exterior and the interior. 2 lions carved on the edges of the wall guard the entrance, marking the inside, despite its capacious opening, as a privileged space. Inside the chamber, at the center of the far wall, is a niche. And above and around the niche on all 3 walls is an elaborate inscriptional program in Persian. There you can see a bit of a close-up there. This extends to nearly half the height of the chamber, whereafter a net and stellate style vaulting begins. After the imposing scale of the monument, it is the inscriptional program that makes an immediate impression. Rising some distance above eye level, it encompasses anyone present inside the chamber. The inscriptions were carried out at 2 different moments after the construction of the monument in 1526 and 27. So the inscriptions themselves are not actually carried out by Babur, by other folks instead. The first inscription, running in 2 horizontal bands across the top of the walls, is most likely commissioned by Babur's son Mirza Askari in 1531. So these bands up here, these are by Mirza Askari, a prince in that time. Those are by Mirza Askari, and then the ones further down are by Mir Muhammad Masoom, who was a Mughal Mansabdar at Akbar's time, He came to Kandahar in 1598 and 99, and he is the one who has sort of the bulk of the inscriptions here. All of these panels are done by Mir Muhammad Masoom. These inscriptions indicate that the completion of the monument by Babur did not signify a permanent closure against potential changes in the form and meaning of the monument. They reveal distinct ideas about authorship. A monument like the Chehel Zina was not considered the sacrosanct or inviolable expression of one individual alone. Rather, it was open to the interventions of Babur's sons and later a noble, each of whom participated simultaneously to leave their own material trace, a legacy, and to participate in the legacy of someone else. In this paper, I examined the intervention of Mir Masoom in particular to explore this practice and ethics of authorship in greater detail. So studying this monument really gave me pause when I first came across it. It sort of challenges the way in which we understand authorship ourselves. If we see a plaque somewhere, perhaps an IBA, no one is going to come in and put their own name on it or start to carve out something else on it. We understand once something is complete, it's complete, and no one else can mess with it or do anything to it. And yet here we have a monument where multiple people who aren't directly associated with the king, who aren't part of his lineage even, are intervening in this. How do we make sense of what's going on there? So a little bit more about Masoom's story, how he gets to Kandahar. In 1593 to 94, Mir Masoom entered Kandahar with Akbar's triumphal forces. Since Mirza Askari's days, much had transpired in the city. It had fallen briefly into Mirza Hindal's hands, who was closely allied to Humayun, but quickly retrieved by Mirza Kamran. These are all the sons of Babur. There's a major succession struggle happening after his death. In 1545, Humayun seized Kandahar with Safavid support and installed Bairam Khan as the governor. However, in the early years of Akbar's rule, the Safavids took control of the city, installing Safavid princes there who became semi-autonomous and eventually deflected back to Akbar's court. Its tumultuous history would continue into the 17th century, exchanging hands between the two empires. It would finally be secured as a Safavid possession, but with the tragic outcome that it would be men from Kandahar who would behead the Safavid Emperor Sultan Hussein in 1722, initiating the beginning of the end of the empire. So Kandahar in some ways really was at the center of a lot of conflict between these two empires and continues, I guess, in some ways to be at the center of a lot of global conflict in our time too. During his stay, Masoom ventured out to the Chehel Zina, which according to him was already a popular site for people to visit, particularly in the spring. In his history, Tarikh-e-Sindh, he elaborates that even while the names of Babur, Mirza Kamran, and Mirza Askari were mentioned in the inscription, the names of Humayun and Akbar were not. For Masoom, absence serves as the ground for intervention. In comparing the territories of Akbar with Kabul and Kandahar, the territories of Mirza Kamran, Masoom rightly perceives an old family feud is taking place here. Kamran and Askari have gone to their graves, but the enduring testimony of stone, their work of legacy, appears as an embarrassment to Mir Masoom. Yet here he doesn't go ahead and simply scratch out those inscriptions. That would be the modern impulse. If a monument contradicts our historical understanding, our ideology, you go ahead and smash it. That's not what he does. Instead, he adds his own inscription to it. Across 6 panels carved into 3 walls under the Askari inscription, Masoom carved another one. His text runs vertically between the panels and horizontally within them in a continuous motion from the right side of the chamber to the left. From here, the inscription continues on to the left side of the outer wall next to the pishtak. I'll read sort of some excerpts from the inscription and then I'll discuss it in a bit more detail. The inscription is in Persian and I'm translating. It has been carved into the mirror of the mind of the people of knowing that the realm of Kandahar was under the control of the ancestors of Jalaluddin Akbar King Ghazi Khaldul Malkuhu. In the time of Humayun Badshah Ghazi, the land of Kandahar fell out of the rule of his house. Because of the fortune and power of the King of Kings, many climes of the inhabited quarter, whose length extends from the limits of Sri Lanka, Orissa, Bandagore, Gaur, Bengal, to Thatta, Lari Bandar, and Hormuz, which is nearly 2 years of distance in travel, and its breadth extends from Kabul and Kashmir to the limits of the Deccan and Berar, which is a distance of nearly 1 year of travel, were conquered. So he's basically describing the limits of Akbar's territories in this moment. In 1593 to 94, the domains of Kandahar came under the control of the slaves of the court of the refuge of creation. May it not be hidden that between these mentioned limits are countries and cities and forts aplenty, whose counting is difficult. Some are summarized as proof. The inscription then goes on to list 106 places, moving from a generally east to west direction. It was initially, this gallery was called by Mirza Askari in that top inscription as world revealing, as Jahan Numa. And here Masoom is quite literally turning it into a world revealing space, not the views that are sort of being projected outwards, but the names of all the territories that are now in Akbar's possession, 106 of them. The names start at the bottom of the center right panel, run vertically around the central niches, horizontally within the central left panel, vertically again over the left wall, horizontally inside the first left panel, and then ends on a vertical line at the outer edge of this panel. The list of the names quite literally visually produces the world. The correspondence between the left to the right movement of the text and the east to west progression of the list gives it a distinct feeling of reading a map. Its position around one corner evokes the notion of the inhabited quarter from Islamic geography, which held that only a quarter of the Earth's surface was populated. So most of the names are sort of in these panels here. The placement of the cities running horizontally inside the two perpendicular panels and vertically on the edges is also intentional. The Mughal heartlands appear inside the panels, including the capitals of Delhi, Agra, and Lahore, but also the recently conquered lands like Jaunpur, Burhanpur, Malwa, Berar, and Mandu. On the edges appear the cities of the east, Bengal and Bihar, of the south and west, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Multan, and Sindh. The arrangement reflects a keen sense of the important places of the Mughal Empire. The inscription concludes with a prayer. Masoom hopes for a world-encompassing sovereignty by evoking the names of Akbar, his sons, and his grandsons. The inscription admits the limits of Akbar's sovereignty, but also uses the world-revealing monument to extend towards a future of universal territorial rule. The world is revealed as divided into the named regions and cities under Akbar's control and the unnamed remainder that will come under Mughal rule in the future. The inscription ends on the final panel, whose edge is flush with the Askari inscription. However, the Masoom inscription continues running vertically on the outer edge of the final panel, disrupting the symmetry and the correspondence between the two inscriptions. So, this is where the Askari inscription comes to an end. Masoom's inscription continues on, and then it runs here, and then shifts to the outer wall here as well. So this is an independent sort of inscription that Masoom is putting out. It continues, and I'm reading this final bit, right, this liminal peripheral bit of his inscription. May it not be hidden that in the time that the great Lord Khaqani had given the government of Kandahar to the renowned Nawab Shah Beg Khan Abla, that's where this one ends. And then he moves out here. Here the inscription moves from the inner walls of the chamber to the outer left wall, resuming again with the author's name. Muhammad Masoom bin Sayyid Safai, descendant of Sayyid Sher Qalandar bin Sayyid Hussain Zanjirpa bin Baba Hasan Abdal, by pen name Al-Nami, or as we would translate it now, renowned, and by residence Al-Bakari, which is the island city in northern Sindh, right? It's right next to Sakhar. In the chain of the renowned commanders who came to the assistance of Kandahar came one day to this great station. Because he did not see here mentioned the protected domains except Kandahar, he inscribed some of the cities in this gallery. Masoom concludes by quoting two couplets of poetry in praise of Akbar from his own Masnavis, which he composed. So he's giving his own sort of explanation about what he's up to here. In this way, Masoom becomes an unabashed participant of a royal family dispute, taking easy liberty to intervene in the monument of the Mughal founding king. His concern for the missing names of subsequent kings and domains becomes the occasion for inscribing his own name as well. In fact, he records his multiple origins and identities expansively, including relations of genealogy, poetry, place, and service. Masoom's poetry quoted in praise and prayer of Akbar also performs a second function of etching his own compositions and the names of his poetic texts into stone. Masoom's pen name Al-Nami quite literally translates to the bearer of a name, implying renown or fame. His final prayer for Akbar, which is, may his essence be companion to the sun, may his name be joined eternally to the world, directly invokes Masoom's own pen name. Secreted in his prayer for Akbar's eternal fame is a hope that Masoom's name too will endure as the author of a poem inscribed in stone. Yet it is not simply the medium which is to guarantee Masoom's name, but his participation in the site of sovereign power. On the one hand, circumspection characterizes Masoom's inscription. His own name is placed outside the chamber, on the threshold, as if to say that it has no place in the inner sanctum, in the company of the names of kings and princes. He includes one non-royal name in that inner space, that's the governor of Kandahar, and even that is at the very edge of the chamber wall, simultaneously according the governor some privilege, but also showing his liminality in that space. On the other hand, Masoom's extensive introduction is the inscription that a viewer approaching the monument would be closest to first. Located to the left, Masoom's introduction is both deferential in its position, but also autonomous, opening up a new point of interest, removed from the rest of the inscriptions. To read his introduction, the viewer would have to occupy a distinct position outside of the chamber, whereas all the rest of the inscriptions can be viewed standing inside the chamber. This autonomy is only somewhat mitigated by placing the sentences beginning on the inner edge of the chamber. Alongside Masoom's self-abasement, his deference runs a keen interest in representing his own individual self as well. He cares to be remembered by everyone who comes to this monument. What allows Masoom to intervene so boldly in a sovereign site? Right? This is the question that I've been continuing to work with. How in the world was a noble able to intervene in a royal monument? He gives no indication that he was following royal or governor's orders in carrying out this inscription. It seems to be his own initiative entirely. In fact, in both his inscription and his history, he claims full credit for this act. His participation in a royal site suggests notions of authorship distinct from modern ones. An object here, an architectural site, does not correspond to singular authorship, suggesting that the completion of a work is not viewed as producing a fixed and inviolable object. Rather, a work like the Chehel-Zina remains open to subsequent interventions and reorientations, which in the modern context would be read as intolerable violations of original authorial intentions. Historians of architecture are familiar with the ways in which old sites and architecture are reused by subsequent sovereigns as spolia for new monuments or through the acts of renovation and restoration. Yet this is implicitly figured as a scavenging mode of sovereignty, appropriating a broad range of signs, sites, and objects from earlier political cultures. The very word appropriation conveys a violent and willful seizing for new ends. However, the Chehel-Zina cannot be fully explained by these ideas. We must consider that intervening in objects and sites associated with other authors was broadly acceptable in the 16th century. Works of architecture, but also literature and art, were considered open-ended and capable of accruing multiple consecutive authors. Yet both Askari and the Masoom inscriptions also suggest an ethics of participation. Leaving a mark on the monument is not a zero-sum game played out at the expense of the prior. The past is neither dismantled nor effaced. Instead, both inscriptions demonstrate a commitment to the aesthetic priorities and individual legacies of earlier authors. The new political project in each case is staked out by engaging with the terms of the earlier authors. The height and vantage of the Chehel Zina is developed in the Askari inscription, which calls the monument the world-revealing gallery, the Rivaq-e Jahannama, and introduces a new series of associations with the monument and its patrons. The Masoom inscription, in turn, extends the play upon world-revealing with a list of places comprising Akbar's dominion. Each new intervention engages with the older, retaining the past and continuing some of its interests. This ethics provokes a reconsideration of modern analytics of reuse as appropriation. This analytics rests upon the idea that a completed object is the expression of the individual self and intentionality. Any intervention in a completed object can only be seen today as a violation. Preservation as a modern project is premised on this assumption, where the past as object must be disentangled from the living. Anand Taneja's work has shown how the Archaeological Survey of India violently turned Firoz Shah Kotla into a, quote, dead space. It is upon this disaggregation that a monument becomes available for particular forms of modern engagement, which Shanti Kaveri Bauer calls monumental encounters. These are psychological dramas, as she describes them, where engagement is played out in terms of power and resistance, and the only material outcome possible for the monument appears to be destruction. This is her study after the demolition of the Babri Masjid. However, the Chehel Zina shows that monuments remain open to further participation, premised upon continuing the concerns of older authors, and through that act, creating a legacy for new ones. The individual emerges and is clarified in these engagements, not as the author of a unique and inviolable object breaking dramatically with the past, but in participating in older works. Here, the distinction with the graffiti present at the Chehel Zina is instructive. Between the Askari and Masoom inscriptions, dozens of people have inscribed their names and sometimes dates in Persian and English. Let me see if we can see those anywhere here. I guess they're not as clearly visible, but all along here you can see names of people sort of etched in with marker. Sometimes people scribble them in, running in all the empty spaces between these original inscriptions. Rehmani Hosseini's name has been written into the second Masoom panel in white, first in Persian, then English, with a date connecting it back to 1976. Nur Khalid's name is written in black above the Askari inscription and dated 1975. There are many other names left behind in different colors and different hands. Most are male and many of them dated to 1970s. Here too, a desire to leave one's name is palpable. That much they share in common with Mir Masoom. But to participate in the monument, not simply as spectators, but also as creators. Yet what sets this practice apart from Masoom is a distinct lack of interest in continuing or engaging with the aesthetic, political, and intellectual commitments of earlier creators.
Dr. Rajani, we are about to finish now.
Sure, I'm also almost at the end. The ethics of creation, which animates the endeavor of leaving individual legacies, has crucial implications for our understanding of the relationship between sovereign and individual, and for the dissemination of sovereign practices, ideologies, and projects. Scholars have long understood the Mughal world to be characterized by shared and layered sovereignty, where the responsibilities and prerogatives of power are delegated and reproduced at a diminishing scale. So the idea that power comes from top down. Rather, when we look at the way in which Mir Masoom participates in this monument, we see that there is initiative from below. People are participating in Mughal kingship to further their own individual interests as well, to leave their own names for posterity as well. Power works in different multivocal, multi-directional ways in the Mughal Empire as well. Yet the individual's effort to leave a legacy by participating in the open-ended projects of others often evades the modern observer. This is not only because moderns are used to identifying individuality with a forcible differentiation from the past instead of an enthusiastic participation in it. It is also because earlier people like Masoom staked their claims to individuality through self-deprecation, which reaffirmed existing hierarchies but also subtly undercut them. Moderns too often understand this mode of self-presentation as servile obsequiousness and the very antithesis of individuality. I guess I'll stop here and maybe open up some of the things that are left in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shayan, Rajani. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard three very high quality papers here in this conference today, and I'm pretty sure that a number of questions would be there in your minds. So the floor is now open. Anyone can stand up and ask the question, and do mention to whom your question is directed to. और सवाल आप अंग्रेज़ी में भी कर सकते हैं, उर्दू में भी कर सकते हैं. अपना तारुफ करवाइएगा प्लीज़.
Thank you very much. Question and comment to Moiz's presentation. Moiz, I'm really happy to see your overall research work. But here, one of your argument related to the you actually try to relate the science with the metaphysical and the theological concepts of Muslim philosophy and theology. But here actually the central authority and the central personality actually
made a dichotomy, I would say, or maybe I didn't really understand, maybe you can clarify that better, between the objective reality, the external reality, and the imagination, the takhayyul. So I'm trying to understand, do you really make this dichotomy, or do you think that this is these are connected, continuum in some ways? And if they are, how does theology come into that? You know, how do you connect this whole idea of takhayyul with the realities and the imaginations, and then seeking the truth?
Scholar in history, and currently I am visiting faculty in different institutes, including the University of Karachi. So I am very much grateful to listen to you guys. I have a very simple question, and that is to the last respective speaker. We talked about monuments and architects in Mughal period. We know in history these things help us to understand history. But sometimes, to me, they mislead us. For example, if we talk about Shayan, as you talked about, from 1627 to 1658, as he is called the Prince of Mughal architect. And his period is called Golden Age of Indian history. But to me, that is not the golden period because of architect or monuments. They are not enough. They are misleading us. We can see good architect or good monuments of Shahjahan's period, but at the same time, we can see people without food. And at the same time, we can see mothers who are selling their children in order to get the meal of 3 times. Simply, I mean, how mislead these architects us to understand history. This is my question. Thank you.
We should allow the participants to first answer these questions, and then we'll have another round. Yes, Doctor.
Thank you. I'm very impressed by the questions, both the questions on economics, the Persianate discussion about the science, so that is amazing. And also asking such interesting questions, which one of these questions actually my PhD dissertation advisor he asked me this question as well. And this is a very good question for Nafsu Kama. Rajani is not the first person to use this. Definitely, there's a whole tradition before him as well. But what Rajani does is something he understands this in a very different way. And this is his novel contribution, which is as follows, that before him, for example, Lucy understands and uses this concept of Salama, but the way he understands this is to refer to the active intellect, which is going back to the Sina's philosophy, which we have the intellects, and then we have the lowest intellect, the active intellect, which is responsible for whatever is happening in the world. And in the active intellect, you have the forms. The intelligible forms are the active intellect. And what we see is that Nafsul Amr is referring to, ultimately, referring to these forms of intellect in the active intellect. So it's tantamount to the forms in the active intellect itself. Now, when we come to Rajani, what he does is that he dispenses with the whole idea of an active intellect, which is a major thing. This is a major, building a block from this whole metaphysics of Ibn. Because Ibn Sina's metaphysics, which is 2C's metaphysics as well, is premised on this idea of an active intellect, this intellect theory, with a very heavy metaphysical system. What Rajani does is that he says he severs this relationship between us and the active intellect. He says the active intellect, I don't know. It doesn't really matter whether it exists or doesn't exist. I'm not reflecting on that. I'm only looking at this economical, human-centered epistemology. I'm not worried about the ultimate metaphysical lesson to what those intelligibles are, where they are, doesn't really matter. Right? I'm looking at this human-centered, very deflationary epistemology, which is just to think about language, Nafsul Amr. Nafsul Amr means this realm, which is the realm of the thing itself. Right? And here, this is a very big breakthrough, I would say, right? That he lets go of this metaphysical baggage, and he turns towards this economical, human-centered epistemology, and he uses that and writes a book of Risala on this. This Risala, before we don't find anyone writing Risala, a Risala fi tahqiq Nafsul Amr. So making this into a central term. And what we see after Rajani is that people now pick up this term and they refine it further, improve upon it, expand upon it. So Rajani once is responsible for making this like a mainstay term, dispensing the metaphysical baggage. And additionally, he uses this term to apply it to understand science and philosophy of science in particular. And he does that by thinking about the mathematical entities and the models of astronomy. Right? What is the ontological status? So he's applying that. He's applying that. This is very unique. You don't find this before. Right? So in these two senses, one is testing metaphysics, and second, applying this to solve problems of science and philosophy, particularly philosophy of mathematical entities. This is something we found in Rajani, which is unique, and then carried on for people after Rajani. And then a little bit of this, your question about this division, does he make this division? He does. He is one of those scholars who is very articulate in making this division between three levels. One is the realm of the kharij, which is the external world, the world that you experience using your sensory perception. And then the second is the world which is called zahni, wujud zahni, which is the existence given to a person through their mind. And again, we have the human individual here who's experiencing either through their sensory perception, which is kharij, or they're experiencing through their mind. And then he says there's a third level, which is this Nafsul Amr, where you don't need the human subject. This is like the primary de facto mode in which a thing is in itself. Right? Prior to a human being coming up and putting his subjective analysis. Right? But prior to that, there is this realm which is the realm of Nafsul Amr. And he writes about all of this, and I sort of write about this in my papers, in my writing as well. He sort of explains what these three realms are. He explains what does it mean that things are established in each of these realms. And he explains the relationship between all three of them. And I can sort of elaborate on that after this if you want as well. That how the Nafsul Amr relates with the kharij and with the zahn, with the zen. He relates this to theology, is what the last part of your question. He does this in an interesting way that even though he's deflationary in his metaphysics, he's sort of just looking at the humble economical thing, right, in the concept of not worrying too much about the metaphysical baggage. But in his Kitab al-Ta'rifat, which is the book of definitions, there we find that he says that ultimately this is referring to the forms, this is referring to the knowledge of God. Right? So he sort of equates that at that level, that this nafs of amr, things in itself, is sort of metaphysically, mystically, right? And this is like the Sufi baggage coming in. Right? In a Sufi way, you understand that all of this knowledge of nafs of amr is referring to God's knowledge, right? And one may not have access to that. Right? One may not have access because what you have access to is your experience. Right? You experience things subjectively using your external senses. You might experience things mentally using your brain. But what the things are in themselves, right? That is another realm. Right? So you have sort of interesting comments about that.
Thank you. Now, Zahra, would you like to answer?
Thank you very much for the question. बिल्कुल ये है कि the text Amir Khusro, the argument that he's making is not that Arabic poetry is not good or it's limited in any way, but he's saying that it's harder to be a Persian poet than Arabic because the rules for Persian poetry are more stringent. Thank you so much for the reference for Yasin Mazza Siddiqui. I looked that up. And what he says is because you see, I just use an example of an Urdu sher. Of course, you would know this, but just to explain it to everybody else, because that is a language comprehensible to everyone here. दिल ही तो है ना संगो खिश्त दर्द से भरना आए क्यों रोएंगे हम हजार बार कोई हमें सताए क्यों. So भरना आए, I and satae are qafiyah. Qafiyah is what rhymes. So it doesn't have to be the same word, but it just has to rhyme. And kyun is radif. So kyun has to be the exact same word. So if you don't have kyun, if you don't have the limitation of radif, you can have qafiyah, satae, I. It's much easier to do poetry then. So what Amir Khusro is saying is that Arabic, whatever genre of Arabic poetry is talking about, you don't have this limitation of the radif. So that makes it easier to be an Arabic poet. So over here, I know that sometimes in Orientalist scholarship especially, the tension between Arab and Persian is played up too much. And I remember my professor Wael Halak used to say, and I would love for Moiz to also address the question that before we move to Shayan, or after Shayan has asked, I would love for Moiz to address this question that Dr. Jaffar and I posed. He used to say the Orientalist scholars love to say, okay, look, they wrote about these, in Arabic they've written about akhlaq or ethics, or that's because ethnically they are Persian, so they are more philosophically inclined, or they are less of, barbaric and fundamentalist, and while so that the ethnicity plays a role, and or maybe even that Sufism is intrinsically more Persian than Arabic. So we come across these ethnic sort of presumptions and misunderstandings in Orientalist scholarships, and they make ethnicity probably. Halak used to argue that. A scholar of law, that he used to argue that the Orientalist scholarship make the question of ethnicity more important than it is. So I would say he was not at all, being derogatory, but he was just trying to say what we do is more impressive. And it is a fact, if you think about it, throughout history, how many native Arabic speakers have written in Persian and Urdu, and how many Iranians have really, even till today, their Arabic is very good, and I envy it, and they are learning Arabic, and Urdu walas are learning both Persian and Arabic and Turkish. So this is how even the hierarchy works, and the talent also that way works that way. So yeah, that's what I would say about this. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It doesn't perhaps directly relate to my presentation, but it's an interesting one. And there's a bunch of recent histories that trace the emergence of the idea that hunger is the responsibility of the state, and that comes from the late 19th century, perhaps the 20th century. Interestingly, Mughals also fed the poor. Akbar had a bunch of sort of establishments जहाँ पे लंगर जारी होता था. Jahangir, I think, has a famous miniature where he is shooting at poverty. So these were some of their interests, but for them, mainly kingship was about doing justice and about making sure that no oppression happens. That seemed to be more important for them within the larger tradition or ethics of kingship that was coming from the akhlaq tradition. For them, what was most important is a just king. For them, the link to the prosperity of the kingdom was not about directly feeding them, not about agricultural management per se, but वो एक नियत की भी link थी. Jahangir mentioned in the Jahangirnama a story about how an emperor with good intentions causes his orchards to grow in the empire much, much better. And an emperor with ill intentions, his orchards wither away. So there's this kind of a direct connection between intention of the king and the realities of his kingdom. So very different understandings of the expectations of state than the modern ones that we hold today. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Yes. आप कर लें फिर ये कर लेंगे.
You talked about India is the land of spices, the smell of bazaars. We usually see in poetry, we talk about love because people justify it as it can be felt. But I will oppose that thought. You know, even if we just look around here, the architecture speaks for itself. History is spoken, it can be felt. The buildings, the people, it's not just us. The spices, everything that make it all up, it speaks for itself. It has feelings in it. So why just, when we are doing poetry like Khaled, you mentioned, why are we just talking about love? And Amir Khusro there's like this article or this book, Amir Khusro ki Kahani, Khusro ki Zabani. And like, it's really wonderful. It talks about a lot of things. And you also mentioned about how females are addressed, their rights. It was really wonderful. It's not a question, but a comment. It kept us thinking about so many things. There are a lot to do, and we are here. We are just running after assignments. And we really forget about thinking the world needs our thought. We need to think about this thing. Later in life, maybe not now, but after 10 years, 5 years, or maybe never, some of us, it will get us thinking. These are thoughts that needs our thought. They needs to be addressed.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any question? Yeah.
Teach finance here, so the idea of attending this workshop is out of curiosity and my interest in history. My question is from Dr. Shayan, Rajani. आपने बताया कि ये जो लिखी हुई चीजें, सॉरी आई एम नॉट अ स्टूडेंट ऑब्वियसली, और फिर उसको एक्सटेंड किया, फिर लोगों ने अपने बाप दादा और उनके नाम इस तरह. सो आई थिंक दिस थिंग स्टिल गोइंग ऑन. यानी जो वो ओनरशिप है, वो लोग जैसे रामबाग को आरामबाग बना दिया, लालू के खेत याकताबाद बन गए, ये अभी तक भी चल रहा है. आई एम अलहमदुलिल्लाह प्राउड सन ऑफ सॉइल ऑफ सिंध, जहाँ पे हमारे घर में शाह बिटाई की पोइट्री से प्यार करना सिखाया गया, ज़मीन के साथ प्यार करना सिखाया गया. ये क्यों इस तरह है? एंड आई थिंक बिकॉज ऑफ दीज, और जब तक मैंने हाई स्कूल कम्प्लीट किया था, आई थॉट कि मोहम्मद बिन कासिम आए सिंध में, बाबुल इस्लाम और यहाँ पे नदियाँ और दूध की नहरें बहना शुरू हो गई. वाई दिस bullshit being taught to us? I respect my Pakistan students, teachers and Islamic teachers, but why they have taught us like that? और इसी वजह से शायद आई थिंक एक अब रेजिस्टेंस आई है यंग जनरेशन में कि वो कहते हैं कि आप भगत सिंह के जो है मॉन्यूमेंट आप लगाएं, उसका नाम उसको करें, या राजा तारिक जो है जिसको हमने विलियन के तौर पे देखा था, लेकिन अब हम सिंधी नेशनलिस्ट लाइक मी थिंक उसने सिंध का दिफा किया था against Muhammad bin Qasim, and we consider it like a hero. So that's my question. Thank you.
So previously, and in most history, when we see 200, 300 years ago, we see that architecture and architectural styles were very prominent for certain cultures and certain societies. Like architecture that was in Greece, you would not really see that in Sindh or in the subcontinent. But now, I feel like with globalized societies, these sort of boundaries between architectural styles are getting really blurred. So it's sort of like a question, like I'm curious about how, I'm so sorry, yeah, so I'm curious about how, what do you think 100 or 200 years into the future, how would historians be studying the material culture of today? Because you won't really have those lines, you know, because they're also blurred out. How would you sort of understand, oh, this was Greek architecture and this was Pakistani architecture? Because we're sort of shifting into modern style architecture and pre-modern architecture, right? So how do you think that will be interpreted 100, 200 years into the future? And I also have a question for Dr. Moiz. So this was sort of on the comment that Ms. Sabri made about presumptions based on ethnicity. And it's not sort of related to history, more on current situations. So I've been seeing these posts on social media and just, you know, in the current atmosphere with the Russian and Ukraine war, about how certain journalists have sort of spoken about the war and refugee situation by sort of saying that oh, this is not a war in a Muslim country, and this is between civilized people and people who have blue eyes and fair skin. So do you think if this is happening on such a global platform with people who are actually educated and you know, we turn to places like you know, CNN and BBC for information, and we don't really tend to fact check them because we think of them as the ultimate source of information. Do you think that we as a society are just getting more comfortable with making presumptions based on ethnicity, or do you think that this is something that has carried on for generations?
There's a gentleman there. After him, I'll ask you. Yes, please. Mic idhar de de.
Yes.
No, excuse me. First he, and then we'll come to you.
To each of the panelists, Zara, you towards the end of your talk, you talked about the Turkic people, and as I understand it, the Muslim sort of influence in India at the time that you're describing was to a large extent an extension of the Turkic Central Asian world into India, and I was wondering if you could speak just a little bit about the role of Turkic languages, perhaps Chagatai, in India at this point in time. Shayan, I was, when you were speaking, I was thinking about the Orkhon inscriptions, even though those go back another 700-800 years, and I was hoping you could speak just a little bit about this form of the materiality, the whole business of carving out inscriptions, and whether there's a longer Turco-Mongol tradition over here that this is a part of. And Moiz, when you were setting up your talk, I started thinking about Joseph Needham's work on science and civilization in China. And that got me thinking whether the study of Muslim science and the sort of pedagogical and the research agendas that come out of it would benefit from ways in which other scholars have approached the study of non-European science and quote-unquote civilization. Thanks.
And my question is to you. You raised some thought-provoking questions about authorship. And so from our perspective, Masoom's inscriptional program would be completely unacceptable today. However, do you have any indication of how it was perceived at the time that it was made? And up Sunday? Okay, so my question was, how was this inscriptional program or intervention perceived at the time that it was made?
Your question.
From different background, but since this topic was doing history in Pakistan, that bring me and brought me here. So my question is from Dr. Moiz. So you mentioned that in the work of Rajani, Defense of Mathematical Sciences, So in his work, he put aside the metaphysical aspect of mathematics, and he worked on economics and a tangible aspect of mathematics in that era. But then you said that his findings led that his work was knowledge of God, means he first puts aside the metaphysical aspect of mathematical sciences, and then that led to his findings as a knowledge of God. So I find it a bit difficult and confusing, so it takes an attention. And my second question is from Zahra. So you mentioned that we have got many things from Amir Khusro in poetic and in prose form, but I find it very rare that we haven't seen any trace or any cultural or archaeological architectural things in present day Persian world. We see many things from Persian world in our subcontinent area, but thank you.
You should take the answers first, and then we'll see if there's time left. We'll have other questions too. जी आप पर कुछ है आपके पास जवाब सवाल है आपके पास?
I totally agree with Professor Pradhan's analysis here. There is this push that the way history of science is written, especially in many surveys, and also public surveys, is Eurocentric bias. There's a Eurocentric bias, and we sort of recenter the big picture and provincialize the world. Because there are other scientific philosophical traditions which are out there which need to be studied, not just Islamic, but also Chinese and Indian. Which are very important. What we find, unfortunately, is that because there's this emphasis on looking at the early modern science and scientific revolution and what gave us the scientific revolution, that hampers historical inquiry, and there is sort of, even in our school books, there's this tradition of Plato and NATO. So whatever falls within the line, Plato and NATO, and that's good science, and everything else is irrelevant or bad science. And that has the effect of blinding us to looking at any other alternative intellectual traditions, and just, not even looking, not even examining, not even sort of going and doing that research, which is unfortunate. And I would say the last 20 to 30 years or so, there has been a shift within within the area of history of science and philosophy, within Islamic society, historians and philosophers. They have been looking more back now towards minor figures and going and sort of doing the written work, which is sort of the manuscripts and examining. And the manuscripts are in places like Vatican, for example, Vatican, Paris. They're just mind-blowing, basically, and we know what those apply to the manuscripts. Very difficult to understand what exactly is happening in Muslim science. The second question, which is about the metaphysical values, what I said was that Rajani, he dispenses with the entire metaphysics of the intellect theory. The intellect theory, where you have the seven intellect and then you have the active intellect, he dispenses with all of that. And that is a very novel and interesting contribution that he makes. He, however, does the ultimate reference of Nafs Ahmed. He, in his Kitab al-Tariq, what he mentions is God knowledge. But he doesn't speak about the intermediary between, right, the intellect theory. So you can see that he is still trying to be deflationary in that sense, economical in that sense, that he doesn't want to accept any of these intellect theories, but rather limited. Mathematics is strongly concerned, it is concerned with the Nafs al-Ahmed, right, the objective reality. And even the final thing, whatever it's referring to, he doesn't sort of mention that in his Kalam work. It's only in his Kitab al-Tariq, the book of definitions, where he mentions that, I think, or doesn't speak more about that.
Dr.
Does he come up with alternative sources of knowledge?
Yeah, because ultimate reality or ultimate idea that they say is God, from where the will these people is made, just to come up with some alternative source of knowledge. Or the connection between the human intellect and some extraterrestrial sources.
I'm still unclear with the question in the sense that that we expecting other source of knowledge, whatever the source of knowledge would be God himself.
The way you answer this question of, I thought that you had some, there was some reflection of a lateral idea state from there, because there is an idea and there is an ultimate idea and there is a connection between the ultimate idea and the spiritual idea. So here, the whole thing is confined to the spiritual idea that inhabits the human mind or human being or the human body. So where there is that stream of prophecy, stream of ideas emanating, if not God, the body.
Right. So it is emanating, ultimately, the ultimate development would be all knowledge is coming from God, and he accepts that, he likes about that. But what he is sort of resisting is a particular theory of metaphysics, which is quite prevalent at his time, which is this active intellect theory, which says that there is this first intellect, which is God himself, and then you have the second intellect, and the third and fourth, second, and then finally the active intellect. And the God is too unconcerned about what's happening in this world. And he leaves it to the active intellect, which is the closest proximate to the world. And the active intellect is responsible for basically whatever is happening in this world, the processes of generation or corruption. So the God, he has knowledge of the general, in a very general way, doesn't have knowledge of the particulars. That knowledge of the particulars is coming from the active intellect. That is an idea which Rajani sort of challenges.
Dr. Sahib, I mean, what I have understood by from the paper and from what Rajani was trying to do, to me, if I'm right, it was not a case of, ilm al-kalam, two premises sort of interacting with each other and cross, fertilization is taking place. It seems that the argument in the paper is this, that the knowledge of the external world or physical and mathematical world, that is inbuilt in theology. And that is what it seems has been presented here. But I think that we should learn more about it. I'm not at all aware about the work of Rajani. Maybe further study would enlighten us. Yeah. Dr. Sahib, ye le lein mic hai.
with empty fiction. So there has to be some reality to these mathematical constructs. You cannot glorify God with fictions. You need to have something which is there, which is real. And that's why he sort of links this whole discussion with Nafs al-Amr, that there is some correspondence that we're seeing with that knowledge, and that enables a person to glorify and glorify God himself.
You now, Zara,
just so that this question doesn't मेरा सवाल रह ना जाए, I'll just remind before I answer मोइज़ कि थोड़ा सा जुर्जानी के ईरानियन मिलियू के बारे में थोड़ा सा बात करेंगे कि किस हद तक असरअंदाज होता है या नहीं. जी हाँ जी हाँ जी हाँ.
The second is, I think, regional. That Rajani was in Shiraz for several years, Shiraz, Iran. And he was there until Temur came, the government basically everything in Shiraz. And Temur, when he came and he conquered Shiraz, he was also enough to realize that the land is God. So I should not, I should take it with me. And then Temur took Rajani with him, along with other scholars in Shiraz, and they went to Samarkand. And in Samarkand, they established a city, which was like the city of scholars, where you had the peasants, the musicians, the scientists, etc. Then was famous in Samarkand. And eventually, when Temur went, then Rajani came back to Shiraz. And he lived there, I think, till the end. So there is, I think, one relevance here to Persian knowledge.
Thank you very much. अच्छा तो I think हमने ने जो सवाल किया था this question that had asked, why don't we see more themes in poetry? Why not what we see all around us? Why is it not there in poetry? So I think that was the mark of classical poetry until the late 19th century when the British came. Before that, our poetry, it would be structured around certain popular themes. That poetry, there's a theme of tasawwuf. Okay, I've written an Arifana Shair, so I've written a Shair. So I've written a Shair which is trying to, understand God, or on the theme of God. I've written a Shair on the theme of, love. So worldly love and divine love, these were the two the major themes. And then the language also, there was a set, like a toolkit that was being really used. So you showed your art through a certain limited number of tools. That was the way it was understood. With the coming of the British, and they did have the criticism that our poetry, I think of course they were not understanding our poetry, so it would be easy for them to criticize it. So it's limited in its scope. So people like Hali, Maulana Hali, and some certain other native intellectuals under the influence of colonialism, and perhaps it would have happened anyway. They said, okay, we should write about social issues, other issues, things around us. So we saw more poetry like, Hali writing, Roti kyun kar mayassar aati hai. And that's within 2 generations of Ghalib writing about other things. It was a big change. So yeah, then there was like to write about real life around us. But previously, and even to some extent today, the Ghazal poets, whatever they are writing about, if they're writing about love, disappointment, anything else, they're writing about themes. You can't read their life into it. You can't say this happened to him in life. It's a theme, tanhai, you can write about it. You can be a person living in a house, a big joint family, but he's writing on a theme of tanhai. Someone who's just 10 years old is writing on ishq mein disappointment. He has not experienced anything, but he can do that. So that's how these themes work. So it's a मज़ामीन, ये कहते हैं इस मज़मून पे लिखना, गालिब इससे तसव्वुफ़ एक अच्छा मज़मून है शायरी के लिए, you know, so it's like that, it's like a, you know, profession. Second, Turkic influence. Dr. Karrar asked this question about Turkic influence. Yeah, it's very interesting. When the Mughals came initially, Babur's the first major text, and it's a major text globally, the Baburnama. And of course for Mughal studies it's a very major text that it was written in Chagatai Turkish. But we do understand that till the time of Jahangir, like after Babur, then Akbar, then Jahangir, Turkish was understood and perhaps spoken a bit in the household. And it's a classic, you know, migrant thing. Third generation, after third generation, forget about that. You're more part of the milieu. So, but at the same time, already after that, and we kept getting streams of Central Asians coming in to India. And Persian, whatever the ethnicity was, Turkic somehow, Turkish, whatever different Turkish dialects, even within Ottoman Turkey itself, for a long time it was not a prestigious language. You compose a little bit in it, but Persian was the major administrative and poetic and other language. Same over here, 600-700 years ago, we find certain kingdoms in India experimenting with having a local language like something Urdu-ish and administration, but you know, it's a whole developed structure that comes with Persian, and then they kept on, you know, switching to Persian. So it was remained very prestigious until the British. It was not our decision ever to remove Persian. Even as we started writing more and more in Urdu, it was the British who took the decision, and you know, we can still think about whether you know, the price we have paid for that decision to switch to you know, switch from Persian. So yeah, that's the we could say, and generally many. So in the pre-modern period especially, and even to some extent now in diverse societies, just because you have a home language or a dialect, it is not understood that it's not an understood thing that you would be using it for your business, or you know, you would probably be trying to use a bigger kind of lingua franca for that. And the last question that the gentleman at the end asked about we see a lot of Persian influence in India, in South Asia, but do we see a reverse influence? So that's interesting. I would, it's a very interesting question. We do understand, of course, Hindu civilization, especially Vedic civilization, it's very, very old. So we see, even before the coming of Islam, philosophical and some scientific influence, linguistic, going from India to elsewhere. So today what the number 1, 2, 3, 4, what it's called Arabic numerals. In English they call it Arabic numerals, but in Arabic they call it Hindi numerals, because the zero and all this kind of particular, you know, Arabic is written in a particular direction, but the numbers are written in the opposite direction, the same direction as English is written. So that comes from, because Hindi is written in that, it's an Indo-Aryan language which is written in that direction, same as English. So the numbers, the shape of many of them, they were influenced by the experience in India, and then they, even before Islam and right after the coming of Islam, we saw a lot of influence going there. The Indo-Islamic culture that developed, now it was more of a culture which was taking more from Western Islamic lands than giving. So definitely we can say that Sanskrit itself, independent of, you know, this Islamic India, it has had immense influence, especially towards the east of Asia, you know, Indonesia and all those places. Some in Afghanistan, with Buddhism and all that, but in general, Indo-Islamic culture is more of an absorber of influence. And even today, we see that Iranian friends, we say because Urdu is so close to Persian, we think we try to interest them in Urdu. They're interested a bit in Bollywood, but they're not so interested in Urdu because it really bears the stamp of Persian. So it's not necessarily bringing them something amazingly unique. But they are interested in Sanskrit because it has these old ties with old Persian, etc. So, and it's one of the great languages of the world, Sanskrit, and not necessarily what Indo-Islamic culture produced, which was Urdu. Thank you.
It's all right. I mean, you have sufficiently answered the question. एक point जो मेरे जहन में भी आता है वो ये कि इसका कुछ structural reason भी है, पर language in India for so many years. India की कोई language ईरान की official language कभी भी नहीं थी. That made some difference. और फिर official language होने का मतलब है कि court की language भी थी और revenue collection की भी language थी, तो उसकी roots हमारे यहाँ ज़्यादा गहरी बन गई. डॉक्टर साहब आपके पास भी.
Thank you so much for all the questions. I'll try to answer as many of them as I can, and perhaps in the order that I received them. I'll do my best. So, Ahmed Saab, your question I feel like is, at least I interpret it as a reminder that graffiti has dismissive and condescending connotations, and I think you're right that Masoom's intervention and the graffiti actually does have a lot in similar. They're unsanctioned. They're interested in leaving their own individual names behind. And they are also acutely aware that they're going to make that happen by participating in a kingly site. They're not just putting their names anywhere in the world. They're going to a monument that a king has made. I think the difference that I was interested in fleshing out is their relationship to the past. That where Masoom wants to leave his name by engaging with and bringing forward Babur's past, bringing forward Akbar's past, these graffitis that are also making their own mark there are not as interested in engaging that past, bringing that forward. And I think that's an interesting difference between early modern and modern individuality. How they relate to the past. I think that's what I'm interested in exploring. Dr. Saqib, thank you so much for your question. It's lovely seeing you here. And I think, again, perhaps similar to my response with Ahmed Saab, that I'm interested here in precisely thinking of new ways to relate back to the past, not as something oppressive, not as an obligation, as something that one can creatively engage with. And that is how early modern individuals continue to engage with their history. That's also how many people in the modern world continue to do that. But we, perhaps sort of associated with the state and in the academy, are not as attuned to those kinds of relations. In the back, thank you for your question as well. I'd love to chat with you further about architecture in the future. My sense is that identity is not going to disappear. The paradox of our time is that the more similar we get, the more insistent we are about asserting cultural difference. One of the interesting things, again, about the early modern is how deeply interested people were not in participating in a tradition, but in engaging with other individuals. I think that distinction is very interesting to me. Seher, you had a question about how Masoom was received at his time. He boasted about his inscriptions. He told everyone that he could. He wrote it in his books. And he, after this Babur inscription, had a troop of stonemasons that followed him all around the world. He was an ambassador to Iran at a certain point. He took all these stonemasons with him and left inscriptions everywhere. Balochistan mein bhi ek maujood hai, all the way out to Nakhchivan, in Iran as well. And people, biographers in the 17th century who wrote about Mir Masoom also are very interested in writing down all the different places that he left inscriptions in. So he in some ways starts an inscription craze. And a lot of people are then writing inscriptions that put their own names in at royal monuments, at the Jamia Masjid, or at other places like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are coming to the close of this session. बहुत अच्छे 3 आर्टिकल्स आप लोगों ने सुने और तीनों पेपर्स से बहुत कुछ समझने का मौका मिला और दिमाग ने मुख्तलिफ डायमेंशंस में सफ़र किया. अभी जो शयान साहब जब अपना पेपर पढ़ रहे थे तो मेरा जहन एक बिल्कुल दूसरी तरफ गया और दैट्स इंटरेस्टिंग थीम. ये बता रहे थे कि किस तरह से मुग़ल जो मॉन्यूमेंट्स हैं उसके अंदर एक सिंध से एक साहब गए और जाके उन्होंने अपने वैल्यू एडिशन करके आ गए. आपने नाम सुना होगा हमारे मुल्क के एक बहुत प्रोग्रेसिव राइटर थे सैयद सिब्ते हसन. उनका एक बहुत खूबसूरत मज़मून है, حجن بی کا ڈھولا، اور وہ انہوں نے اپنی گاؤں کی یادوں سے شروع کیا ہے کہ ہمارے گاؤں میں ایک حجن بھی آتی تھیں سال میں 1-2 دفعہ، اور ان کے پاس ایک بہت بڑا سا ٹوکرا ہوتا تھا، وہ سر پہ سے اتارتی تھیں اور اتار کے وہ پھر گاؤں کی عورتوں کو، کسی کو دوپٹہ دے رہی ہیں، کسی کو چوڑی دے رہی ہیں، اس کو پیسے ویسے ملتے ہوں گے، اور ہم بچے جو ہیں کونے میں کھڑے ہوئے اپنے نمبر کا انتظار کرتے تھے، اور پھر جب ہمارا نمبر آتا تھا تو حجن بھی اسی ڈولے میں سے ایک کتاب نکالتی تھیں جس میں بہت ساری پرانی پینٹنگز ہوتی تھیں، تو وہ پینٹنگز ان کے تحت شعور میں بیٹھ گئیں۔ پھر انہوں نے کہا کہ برسا برس کے بعد جب میں نے اجنتا اور الورا کے غاروں کے اندر پینٹنگز دیکھیں تو مجھے حجن بی کا ڈولا کے اندر جو پینٹنگز تھیں وہ یاد آئیں۔ دونوں میں ایک چیز یکساں تھی، کسی میں پینٹر کا نام نہیں تھا۔ انہوں نے اس کے انٹرپریٹ یوں کیا، اینڈ ہی واز اینتھروپولوجسٹ اینڈ آرکیولوجسٹ ٹو سم ایکسٹینٹ۔ انہوں نے کہا کہ قدیم تہذیبوں میں آرٹ ایک کلیکٹیو پروڈکشن ہوتا تھا، اس کی اونرشپ نہیں ہوتی تھی۔ یہ اونرشپ جو ہے جب انسانی معاشرے کے اندر آئی تو پھر زمینوں کی اونرشپ شروع ہوئی، اور کنوؤں کی اونرشپ شروع ہوئی، اور جانوروں کی اونرشپ شروع ہوئی، آرٹ کی بھی اونرشپ شروع ہو گئی۔ اور ہم جس زمانے میں ہیں یہ اونرشپ کا زمانہ ہے۔ ڈاکٹر صاحب کے آخری الفاظ یہ ہیں کہ 200 سال بعد بھی آئیڈینٹی کا ایشو رہے گا۔ قدیم تہذیبوں میں کلیکٹیو آئیڈینٹی ہوتی تھی، سب اپنی تخلیقی صلاحیتیں انہی پینٹنگز میں ایڈ کرتے جاتے تھے، جنریشن آفٹر جنریشن۔ تو یہ ایک بڑی انٹرسٹنگ تھیم ہے جو آپ کے پیپر کو سنتے وقت میرے ذہن میں آئی، اور اب جس زمانے میں ہم رہتے ہیں کوئی آرٹسٹ اپنی پینٹنگ کے اندر اپنا نام لکھنا نہیں بھولتا، اور وہ اس لیے نہیں بھولتا کہ پینٹنگ جو ہے وہ مارکیٹ کموڈیٹی بن چکی ہے۔ دیر از اونلی ون آرٹسٹ آئی نو آف جو اپنا نام کبھی نیچے نہیں لکھتے تھے، وہ صادقین تھے، اور بلکہ صادقین کے حوالے سے ایک چیز یہ کہی جاتی ہے کہ ساری دنیا میں ان کی جعلی پینٹنگز بک رہی ہیں، ان ساری جعلی پینٹنگز کی خصوصیت یہ ہے کہ ان میں نیچے صادقین لکھا گیا ہوتا ہے۔ تو یہ چلیں اسی پہ ہم سیشن کو ختم کرتے ہیں۔ بہت بہت شکریہ اس ڈپارٹمنٹ کا، اور آپ اس کے آرگنائزر ہیں، آپ نے بہت اچھی آرگنائز کی۔ ڈاکٹر اکبر زیدی صاحب IBA کو لے گئے ہیں ایک اور زبردست ڈائمنشن میں، سوشل سائنسز اور اکنامکس اور فلاسفی اور ہسٹری، اور اس کا ایک ہم نے ٹیسٹ آج دیکھا۔ تھینک یو ویری مچ آل آف یو، اینڈ تھینک یو پیپل آلسو۔
Thank you so much, Dr. Jaffar, for honoring the occasion with your presence and your comments. ابھی ہمارا انشاءاللہ وی ول ریزیوم ایٹ 2:30، اور بیچ میں ایک پلیز آپ باہر لنچ ہے تو پلیز آپ جا کر پلیز ہیلپ یور سیلف۔ اور یہ میں بتا رہی تھی کہ فیکلٹی لاؤنج میں فیکلٹی ممبرز کے لیے اور ہسٹری میجرز کے ساتھ ریسرچ لنچ ہے، تو پلیز آپ وہاں چلے جائیں، اور باقی ہم نے اوپن جو ہے یہاں پر لنچ فار ایوری باڈی یہاں پہ رکھا ہوا ہے، فیکلٹی لاؤنج آدم جی میں۔ تھینک یو سو مچ۔